and we call that being having an outsider racialization or being perceived as foreigners and a constant threat. It's similar to what happened in 9/11 too.
I was just going to say, right, that does that not draw a parallel with what happened to Muslims or, you know, people from the Middle East originally after 9/11, and you know, more recently in the past 3 or 4 years, you know, a lot of Mexican Americans or Latinos have felt like there was a target on their backs too. So I guess, you know, if different groups have experienced this, is there some sort of working together that is ultimately at the solution? You know, that's going to be at the heart of any solution, is to kind of bring in these different groups and work together.
Well, I think this is an incredible opportunity to connect the dots. That again, we may be targeted for the reasons that are, you know, the perceived connections to China and being blamed for spreading the pandemic and being host of this disease. But we also should look at how other communities are also being affected. If we look at the rate of African Americans who are dying because of lack insurance or being underinsured, and working in sectors where they're more likely to be exposed, including parts of our community, in the API community and also in the Latinx community. And let's not forget that Asian Americans also experienced backlash post 9/11 as well. The South Asian community were targeted, and there have been bombings at temples and things of that nature. And so we have to see the connection that whenever there is a threat, we are considered the foreign threat. And I think that there's been many, many attempts, I think, and this is one moment where we recognize that we need to come together to connect those dots and address the underlying causes of when racism and discrimination is on the rise.
But how do we educate the general public with regard to this need to separate whatever you think of the Chinese government's response, right? Because there are legitimate critiques of, you know, how quickly the Chinese government put out information, how much it shared or didn't share. So, you know, let's say our government here in the US and the Chinese government are warring, so to speak. How do we educate the public to ensure that Chinese American people here and Asian Americans here do not become the casualties of war, the innocent bystanders who are hurt in the process? How do you make that point to separate?
That's a really good question. That's like equating Chinese people with the Chinese government, or equating American people with our President Trump. And if we wanted to be perceived like President Trump and his policy and his administration. I think one option is to try to prove our Americanness, that we've been encouraged by Andrew Yang, that we prove ourselves to be worthy to be American, that we are, if we act in civic ways, that we could actually merit being American. And I don't think that's the actual answer, is to need to prove ourselves. I think everybody is deserving of respect and dignity, no matter who you are, whether, you know, whatever your status is. I think what this pandemic should teach us, I guess, is that we're all, as a human race, and so global, and this pandemic being so global, is that we're all really interconnected. And you could see how what impacts an individual in Asia quickly impacts an individual in the United States, and we should see our common humanity. And so rather than sort of stirring up wars and hate against each other or trying to blame each other, we have to recognize, wow, we're really interconnected. If I don't keep my social distance, I'm going to spread the disease to someone else. And that interconnectedness is sort of the basis of our common humanity.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just going to add, and there's a number of ways that I think we could respond, both individually and institutionally. And one is that what's happening now is that, like this conversation that we're having, there should be many, many more conversations of not only stop being racist, but how can we invest in anti-racism work. And I want to do a big plug for ethnic studies. Why is it that most people don't know who Vincent Chin is, or don't have a contemporary understanding of how US relations with Asian countries have a direct impact on Asian Americans here? That's incredibly important to understand the ways in which our civil liberties have been denied, and how we have been denied basic rights as a community, as well as other communities who are affected by this as well. We are also think that there should be more efforts in the schools. And so we think that from K through 12, and also through other efforts, that there needs to be awareness, not just about this pandemic, but the underlying causes of anti-Asian racism.
That is a really good point about the education starting early in our schools. You know, my son is an 8th grader in a great public school, and they have a textbook that they use, which is state approved for the history. And granted, it has stories of Chinese Americans, you know, throughout the last several hundred years of history here and contributions. I would like to see schools provide more, you know, direct firsthand accounts and source material, primary material written by Chinese Americans, and not just rely on textbooks that are summarized and put into the words of non-Chinese or Asian Americans. Right?
Yeah, we're pushing for a requirement to make ethnic studies required both in K through 12 and at the CSU level. So ethnic studies is one level we need to make change. I think the political rhetoric of our country needs to shift. And I think our Asian Pacific Islander legislators have actually been a good job of trying to denounce hate language, trying to encourage other officials to stand up against anti-Asian hate. On the media level, I think Asian Americans have really been stepping up as well to challenge. So I think we've seen those patterns in history of Asian Americans facing discrimination, but throughout history, there's been a pattern of Asian Americans resisting and challenging and combating the racism that they face. And I think, like Cynthia said, this is another moment where our legislators, our celebrities, our schools and teachers, and our and on a local level, individuals are really standing up to challenge this racism, and actually to, again, not necessarily to separate themselves from governments, but to help other people recognize our common humanity. We want to make the point that this isn't an Asian American issue. This isn't our problem. It's actually other people's problem towards us. And so the education doesn't necessarily need to be done among Asian Americans. Education needs to be done among others.
This issue briefly came up during the ABC7 virtual town hall, and since you brought it up, Russell, what former presidential candidate Andrew Yang said, and that whole approach of showing our Americanness, that was highly controversial. In the days after our town hall, there were people who certainly responded and say, hey, the onus is not on us. Why is that onus not on anyone else? We've already proven our Americanness, and it's essentially saying we have to change our ways to compensate people who have biased and discriminatory feelings. What is your thought with regard to that? I mean, is it just get up, protest, make noise, and say, no, heck no, we won't take it? Or is it, doing that while also continuing to contribute in all the ways that we are contributing? What do you guys think?
Well, I can respond initially. So I did have very, very strong feelings about Andrew Yang's op-ed piece. Well, for one, in our reports, we actually had doctors, healthcare providers, essential workers who were already stepping up and doing their part. And so to suggest that we need to do more of that sort of suggested that we aren't already. And I think on the one hand, I understand that sentiment. It's the sentiment and belief that my parents and perhaps older generations had, as you lay low, work hard, get an education, and that's how you prove your worthiness. And
it's kind of what the Japanese Americans did after they got out of internment camps, right?
Right. And then there were also resistors during that time who said, no, we're not going to stand for this. And so one of the things that I think we do is, this is a moment where this has been a wake-up call. We've had folks who've reported on this site saying this has never happened to me, this form of discrimination. And so this is a moment for us to ask ourselves, you know, what can we do to end racism, not just against Asian Americans, but throughout all our systems and throughout all of our public institutions and society. And so for us, I think it is about stepping up, but not just to prove that we're American and that we're loyal, but stepping up in ways that's about being informed, being civically engaged, voting, and speaking out and denouncing all forms of racism. And that's how, this is actually the very definition of a democracy. And I would argue that Asian Americans, through our efforts in resisting, have made this democracy and this country stronger.
Do you feel like we're collectively doing enough? You know, for the longest time, there's been this, you know, stereotype of Asian Americans not perhaps speaking up as forcefully as some other minority groups in this country, and therefore not getting either a piece of the pie or the attention or the, do you feel like this has really change that trajectory and push more people forward? Because you are seeing a lot of social media campaigns, right? Such as Wash the Hate, with celebrities who maybe previously would be worried about how their fans would perceive them and choose not to get political. They're stepping up. And as you said, there are more media reports, right, of attacks on Asian Americans. And normally, you know, you might say in the past, maybe we wouldn't do as many of those. So do you see this seismic change in any way?
You know, I think so. I think the flood of reports that we received without any publicity indicates that people wanted to share their stories, that they wanted to air their grievances, they wanted to see change happen in a collective way. And that's what we've been trying to do, is to gather their stories and to come up with a collective voice that's stronger, that's clear, and that identifies, here are the specific issues we're facing, and here are some targeted strategies that we could develop. So I think in that case, it's the amount of, I know it's not about a matter of Asian Americans speaking up. I've always heard Asian Americans speaking up and grumbling. If you're in my family, if you're on the bus, you could hear us speaking up and grumbling. It's a matter of who hears it. And maybe the powers that be don't hear Asian Americans' voices or Asian Americans speaking up. But I think in this case, because we've been able to gather the voices and collectively present it, we've been able to have more of a hearing at this moment.
Is the answer also to get more civically engaged and more engaged in the political process? I mean, certainly, you know, since I've been doing this job for like the last 29 years, okay, I started when I was 12, everybody, in case you're trying to do math there at home. But, you know, there was a time when there were not a lot of elected Asian American officials, and that is changing certainly on the local and state level, but also on the national level. And you have some very vocal folks who are out there. So is that a big piece of the, you know, puzzle there, you think?
I think it's all of it. I think that, for one, resistance and fighting back is in our DNA. Even in the early 1800s, you know, Chinese had organized to file lawsuits to address all legal barriers that were being imposed on the Chinese and other Asians. And organizing is something that we've had to do because in some regards, individually, our numbers were so small, so we needed to come together, benefiting from the civil rights movement, but also contributing. We also led in terms of labor rights, women's rights, etc. We've had our own brand of issues that we've really tried to make much more visible. And for those who can vote, we are encouraging folks to really get involved and become civically engaged, whether it's through your church, through your school community, and through government. And I think that's the way that we really, again, strengthen this democracy and make sure that our issues and voices are heard. I think it is important to have more people like us in office and in places of influence, but we also have to make sure that they're grounded in the community and listen to the community. It's not enough to just look like us. They need to also represent the values and the priorities from the community.
Yeah, and that's why I'd like to really acknowledge Assemblymember David Chu of San Francisco and Assemblymember Phil Ting. They've led the way, and through the Asian Pacific Islander Legislative Caucus, they really pushed the governor to denounce anti-Asian discrimination. And they're working to have the governor set up task force to make sure that every state agency enforces its policies and addresses this discrimination. So I think on that level, our legislators have been really, like Cynthia said, close to the ground and hearing what's going on with the community. On the congressional level, Representative Meng from New York, California Congresswoman Judy Chu, they've been really strong leaders in, passing House resolutions against anti-Asian rhetoric. And so I think, like you said, Kristen, there is Asian American political leadership now that's using the collective voice of the people and speaking for us. So I think it is really helpful because, again, it's the rhetoric that's been inflaming xenophobia. It's a media representations that stereotype Asians. And so on that sort of discursive political media level, we need to challenge it at that same level.
Yeah, I have to say, I continue to see this inability to separate the issues facing Chinese Americans and Asian Americans here and whatever folks, think the Chinese government did. I'm seeing even tweets and Facebook comments posted now as I'm talking about this town hall. Join us. People, one says, China lied, Americans died. And it's like, okay, whether or not China lied about things, and there's evidence supporting that there was certainly withholding of information. And there were also, let's be honest, on the highest levels of both governments, US and China, there was criticism leveled at the other that may or may not be based on fact or evidence. But why is that, okay, so let's say China lied. What does that have to do with us as Chinese Americans of Chinese descent living here? And why should there be a bearing on our employability going forward, or, whether or not we face additional violence? Now that is, I find that part hardest to understand. And I guess it's our job. How do we confront that? How do we explain that to people, Russell?
Well, one reason why we have this thinking that that conflates Chinese people with the Chinese government and bashes the Chinese government so much is because it's in the political interest of the Republican Party to do so. That they're deflecting blame of their handling of the pandemic. They're scapegoating China and Chinese people. They made that political calculus. It's okay to scapegoat Chinese people, even in the US, or Asian people in the US, because it's in their political interests to deflect blame and to rile up their base. So I think this conflation of the Chinese government with the virus, with Asian people, is really shaped by, again, the political rhetoric that serves the political interests of that party. And they've been really skillful at it. They continue to do that. We showed you all those pictures of how they're saying China poisons our people. Biden's too close to Chinese officials. And so we really see that making US-China relations a campaign issue is again a distraction from the administration's sort of ineptitude.
Yeah, but is that something that would just change if there were to be, leadership change at the top? If there's,
I think so. Yeah, you wouldn't see so much this quick assumption that Asians are associated with the virus unless Trump insisted on saying, "Oh, it's a Chinese virus," and that getting circulated in the media. Right after 9/11, President Bush said we shouldn't attack or hurt the Muslim American community. In contrast, President Trump insisted on calling the virus the Chinese virus. So he made that connection. He made that nexus so that we have this automatic assumption the virus is a result of China and the Chinese people.
But despite what President Bush said, there were still plenty of attacks on Muslim Americans.
Right, and I think the attacks on Asian Americans would have been a lot less if President Trump hadn't been so insistent on using that terminology.
So what do you think will change the rhetoric? What can we each do to, change this line of thinking, because this is not going away anytime soon. Like you said, right now, earlier on it was the attacks, the verbal assaults and the physical assaults, but now people are sheltering in place. So of course there's less opportunity for that. But then once we start to reopen the economy, it's going to be possibly things like who gets hired, who doesn't get hired, which businesses get frequented and which ones don't, right? Chinatown was first to get hit and it'll probably be last to recover. So what do we do as an individual?
Well, I think that it's important to recognize that we need government intervention, and that is something that I think will be really important. The assumption is that long after we contain this pandemic, that resentment and bigotry will grow, and and Chinese and therefore Asians will be blamed and be subject to this discrimination and xenophobia. And it's because we're viewed as perpetual foreigners. That's the heart of why we're being blamed in this instance, right? That we are somehow a foreign threat, even though there's no connection whatsoever in terms of our involvement. So I think that the key here is that we need to work with our government agencies. We need to support community organizations to continue to advocate, to denounce this kind of political rhetoric. And we also need to organize and continue to do, which I think is the harder work, which is the anti-racism work, the education work, the work that we have to ensure that all Americans are free from discrimination and free from bigotry. And that's the work that's ahead of us.
All right, I see Maggie has joined us. Are we gonna do Q&A now?
Yes, we're going to start the Q&A portion right now. A lot of your questions that have already been submitted were kind of addressed during this discussion, but some that I would like to point out is, are there any specific representatives that we should be writing to, or government officials that we should be talking to kind of address these issues and to kind of help with this advocacy that you guys have discussed?
Yeah, I think it's really important to let our elected officials know that you're concerned about this issue. Whether it's the governor locally here with Phil Ting and David Chu, as Russell had stated, they're very aware of this. We've briefed them on these issues. But this could also happen locally here. And I know with the San Francisco Mayor's office, they're in touch with us and wanting to know how to respond. But the more that residents and voters and folks who are already plugged in speak out about this issue, to really ask, what are you doing in response to this? It's very helpful and effective way to ensure that these are taken seriously.
Yeah, I feel as though our Bay Area local elected officials, congressional level or state level, are already pretty plugged in, from the governor saying, this is no excuse to be racist, to, my Congresswoman Jackie Spear, who's also put out a lot of statements, to ask people not to scapegoat and denouncing it in every way. I feel as though, is that preaching to the choir to reach out to the same elected officials that represent sort of the Bay Area already? And is there a way to, broaden that reach? Really what you need is to change the hearts and minds of people who don't already embrace that line of thinking.
Yeah, I would say one thing is we've had a lot of local elected officials, especially in the Bay Area and in the state of California, speak out about this issue and condemn racist rhetoric. But we need them to do more. We need them to dedicate resources and provide leadership that there needs to be a response. So I think it's great to start with the condemnation, but they also need to back it up with a plan and dedicated resources to do that.
I see what you mean. Yep. Task forces, studies, like funding, right, for anti-discrimination measures, education, and all that. It can't just be lip service, is what you're saying, Cynthia.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions, Maggie?
Yeah. So there was a question about, there's been a few questions of how people can kind of respond on an individual basis. I don't know if there's been, like, if they're being threatened or if they've been verbally harassed. I don't know if that's something that you guys have any suggestions for, or also how, like, the San Francisco Department or Bay Area Police have been responding. Is that anything that you guys can answer?
Our recommendation is that if you are a witness to someone else being harassed, that you actually engage with the impacted individual, check in with that person, ask how they're, and don't give any voice or power to the assailant or the perpetrator. So make sure that the person is safe, and if it's not a safe situation, to invite the impacted individual to walk away. But we don't want to give more voice, again, to racism, but we actually want to make sure that the impacted individual is protected and cared for.
But what does that mean, give them more voice? Does that mean don't respond? Don't, you know?
Right, yeah. So exactly, don't engage, don't respond. If you need to deflect, distract, but it's not a good moment to educate someone, really. And it's not really useful. They're not,
Well,
the perpetrator's not
it's probably futile. I would say that's.
They're not operating out the frontal cortex, so.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of people these days grab their cell phones and start recording and say, "Hey, say that again. Say it again. What you just said to me." And you know, sometimes that turns into a viral piece of video that can be a call to action. Should people not do that?
Well, we're actually coming out with some easy tips on what to do if you're facing street harassment and what to do if you're witnessing. So that should be coming out very soon. I think to Russell's point, you have to assess the particular situation. We noted that women are more likely to be targeted for harassment. And so the first thing that is important is doing a safety assessment. You know, if you feel unsafe, you have no obligation to record or to denounce or to confront somebody who is targeting you. But we do have some basic tips of, you know, ensuring that we try to de-escalate the situation and that you know to ask for help in that situation, especially if there's witnesses or bystanders. And if you feel like you're safe, to document or videotape. But I think we've always been in the position, and I think as a best practice, is safety first, and make sure that you get the emotional support that you need, because it's such a traumatizing effect. And as we've always said, hate, you know, obviously impacts individuals, but it affects entire communities. I mean, we're reading all these same incidents and reports, and the psychological stress and the trauma that we're all encountering is a major issue and a problem. We shouldn't fear having to go out and do groceries or get, you know, medications to support our families. And so these tools are coming out. There's a lot of bystander trainings. And again, to Russell's point, what's important is that for those who feel like they can denounce behavior or racist statements, can do so, and bystanders can help with that. Because I know that for a lot of these bullies or people who feel like they have the license to attack people based on their race or ethnicity, they feel emboldened and feel as though they're speaking for everyone else. So the more that we can drown that out, again, if you're feeling safe to do so, which is not always going to be the case, that's always an option.
Maggie, I think we only have a couple minutes left. So is there a final question?
I think there's one final question. I know everyone kind of has to go, but is there any tips for journalists to kind of help? How can we best kind of cover things right now?
Well, I mean, I appreciate that question, especially if it's coming from a journalist, a fellow journalist. But I think it's important for us to just present facts. I feel like anytime there is a stereotype, whether it's, oh, you know, the way Asians live and eat, it's more prone to diseases. You know, how do you combat that, right? I mean, you combat that by presenting a you know, infectious disease specialist view, doctor's view, and so to be able to do so through information, I think, is number one. And then, you know, don't just say, oh, we've covered too many stories about Asian Americans being attacked already. Let's, you know, where's the news value in that? I think we do need to give voice to people who have been attacked, and also give voice in a way that also isn't biased. Like, just because I'm Asian American doesn't mean I put an Asian American bias or spin or viewpoint, but it does mean I recognize that there is a different life experience and a different side. And I think it's, bringing your own set of experience into your reporting that will ultimately result in both a fair story and an informational story, and one that isn't just embraced by Asian Americans, because ultimately, that's not what you want. You want it to get through to everybody. And unless you have done that, it really doesn't really help, so to speak. So I think just being out there and presenting the facts, and, I know it's hard. Sometimes I feel like, hey, if I report on these issues, I might be labeled as well, like, well, you're just for this side. So I think you have to trust in yourself and your instincts and your gut, and know who you are, and be brave about it. I mean, we all have to be brave ultimately, from, lawmakers to journalists to the individual who's being confronted. We just all have to be brave.
Yeah. Can I just take a moment to acknowledge you, Kristen, and ABC7 for covering this issue and doing it in a way that lifts up the voices of those who are impacted, and especially taking your own advice about, like, this is not an issue that's been exhausted. We need further discussion and coverage.
Yeah, over a long period of time, because it's not going away anytime soon. My colleague Dion Lim has done a lot of great reporting on some of the stories that Asian Americans have told, which are heartbreaking. My colleague David Louie, is telling a lot of stories about Asian Americans who are innovating and bringing solutions and fighting on the front lines. And really the whole station is committed to that. And we're proud to be that, because Asian Americans are a huge part of our community here in the Bay Area. But like you said, this doesn't just affect Asian Americans, it affects every single one of us in some way. And so when all of us feel safe, we're a stronger society. So it's our job, and we thank you, Chinese for Affirmative Action, and also SFC through you, Cynthia, and you, Russell, for being our partners in sharing this information and, empowering people and educating people. Thank you both so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.